You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Denkman. Since May 8th, 1792, European colonists have called that large volcano just off the coast of Puget Sound Mount Rainier. It was given that name by a British explorer, Captain George Vancouver, a gift to his friend Rear Admiral Peter Rainier. But prior to Vancouver's arrival in what eventually became Washington state, the Indigenous peoples in and around the Salish Sea called it by many names. A recent linguistic paper from the Puyallup Tribe of Indians traced those many names for the mountain, where they came from, and what they mean. Here to tell us about the project is Soundside producer Alec Cowan. Hey, Alec.
Howdy, Libby.
So what's the story with this paper looking at the many names for Mount Rainier?
Yeah, so I took a trip down to Puyallup and the tribe's administrative offices to talk with the author of this paper.
My name is Zalmai ʔəswəli Zahir.
He also goes by Zeke for short.
I am a linguist.
Zeke is a Lushootseed language consultant. Lushootseed is one of the many indigenous languages spoken by tribes in the Northwest, specifically here in the Puget Sound region.
We call the name of the language Lushootseed. The academic world knows the name of the language as Lushootseed.
Now, specifically, Zeke has been working with the Puyallup Tribe of Indians on language revitalization. And in recent years, the tribe's language department has been getting a lot of questions about Mount Rainier.
Number one, what is the name of Mount Rainier? And number two, what does the name mean?
Well, there isn't much to the meaning behind the name Mount Rainier itself. It's just named after a buddy of the British explorer George Vancouver. By the way, that buddy never even saw the mountain named after him in person. Tribes have always had their own names for these geological features, which is where we get the name Tacoma, for example.
Right, and some people use a variation of that for the mountain today. I mean, Tahoma. It's generally seen as respectful of Indigenous roots and culture here in the Northwest.
Exactly, but there's a difference in those two words, right? Tacoma versus Tahoma. That kind of variation is one of the reasons Zeke was brought on to do this paper.
There was some common knowledge of a few of the names associated with Mount Rainier, but none of us were sure if that was a complete list. Where the city name Tacoma comes from, no one knew what that word meant.
So Zeke set out to make a full list of the many indigenous names for Mount Rainier and what those names mean.
And what did he find?
Well, just doing this study in the first place is tough. There are 23 languages under the umbrella of the Salish language tree. Many of those languages have dialects that have since branched out over time. So the first place a linguist would go is to speakers themselves.
And ask them what their name is for Mount Rainier. Unfortunately, we have no known first language speakers left, meaning the people that were born speaking Lushootseed or ʔəswəli.
So the next place he looked is in recordings, like past recordings of people saying the name for Mount Rainier.
And we have a few of those.
Lastly, you'd go to written texts, things like dictionaries, newspaper articles.
Linguistic field notes or papers.
And this is where the project gets complicated, because we're talking about old records, but up until 50 to 80 years ago, there wasn't an accurate system for anglicizing the written Lushootseed language.
They didn't have the skills to write sounds that are not in English and so on. So they're less reliable. They're very important because they often contain ethnographic information that's important for the historical development of a name, but the actual pronunciation of it's hard to get from how they write it.
But all that said, after sleuthing through the material he could find, Zeke found 20 names total.
Wow, 20 names for Mount Rainier? And that's just what we know about today, what is able to be preserved and found out. How different are these names?
Well, at least 14 of them come from one word. What Zeke said is the original theoretical word.
The original theoretical word was ta-quote-man, and that form isn't used by any of the tribes anymore that we know of.
as we've touched on, that group is probably the one that most people today are familiar with, where we get Tacoma. Next, there's another set of 4 words sharing a different common root.
Hwak, which means to wipe. One way of understanding that is that it's a sky wiper.
As for the last 2, there's a Chinookwawa word.
Ya Lamatai.
And a Chehalis word.
I don't speak Chehalis, so I'm not going to try to say it.
But big picture, there are these 2 main groups.
The Taquoman and Hwak.
Within those groups, the differences from word to word were more subtle. Some added an N or an M at the end of the word. Some have variations in the use of a B or a D sound. If a word has a ton of variations, that likely means it's older. It had more time to develop and change from what's called Proto-Salish. That's the ancestral language that gave birth to all the others. So with all these variations mapped, Zeke worked to figure out which might be the oldest. Basically, which of those is the quote-unquote original.
The Chinookwawa word is Ya Lamatai, she the mountain. Lamatai comes from the French word for mountain.
Yeah.
So obviously that's probably the newest. The Taquoman form, you could argue that because there are 14 different variants and because most of the languages have a form of that variant in their language, you could say it took longer to evolve those variants and to spread to the different tribes. And so you can say, therefore, the Taquoman form is older. And that would be a very logical guess. However, just because a name is dominant does not mean it's older. The other one that's Chehalis doesn't have any variants that I know of, and it's only used by one tribe. Therefore, I'm guessing that's a newer form than the Hwak or the Taquoman form.
More recent dialect.
Right.
Of it,
Yeah.
So Zeke can't say which one is truly the original, at least from those many source texts. One other way would be to track the meaning of the words themselves and see if there's a through line there.
But I would guess that meanings change over time too, right?
They do. For example,
Taquoman breaks down as an abundant, unique source to get, fetch, or carry water from.
Yeah, I can understand that. I mean, snow from a mountain creates rivers and lakes and streams. It's kind of like fetching the water, or it's bringing the water down.
Right. So that's the literal meaning of the word. But there's also a metaphorical meaning. In many of the archival materials, they list the mountain's name as meaning breast. To Zeke, that was confusing because there's no part of that word that actually says breast in Lushootseed or any of the Salish languages that he could find and speak. But then it clicked.
These mountains that have a permanent snow cap have water that runs down from these mountains, and it nurtures the life in the valleys that the rivers run through.
It's very maternal. Yeah.
Very maternal. And so you get this idea that snow-capped mountains are breasts of the Mother Earth. And this is how the Mother Earth takes care of her children.
This is where the study takes a bit of a wonky linguistic turn, because Rainier isn't the only giant mountain feeding rivers here in the Northwest.
There's Mount Baker, Mount Hood, Mount St. Helens.
Right, and what Zeke found is that these 14 Tacoma-linked names were being used to describe pretty much any snow-capped mountain. So at that point, it kind of becomes a chicken and the egg situation for Mount Rainier.
Whether or not the name for Mount Rainier expanded to being any snow-capped mountain, or Taquoman applied to all mountains, and then for the tribe around Mount Rainier, that became its name. We don't know which way it went. If it was a general term for any snow-capped mountain that came down to just Mount Rainier, then stories that explain Mount Rainier, why it's called that, were created after that happened. If the name started with Mount Rainier and expanded to these other mountains, then these stories that explain the name for Mount Rainier coincide with what it's called.
By the way, it is a little confusing that the easiest name for both of us to use was Mount Rainier, a name that we both agreed is not original.
It's interesting that you both defaulted to that. I mean, he may have been doing you a favor since, to be fair, you don't speak Lushootseed.
I do not.
So, okay, Alec, Zeke spent all this time tracking down these 20 variants for Mount Rainier. What was his takeaway from doing this research? Did it help answer the questions that the Puyallup tribe was hoping that it would?
Well, one of the big motivations behind this was putting together one document that lists all of the known forms of the mountain's name. He says that his list likely isn't exhaustive, but it's a very solid foundation. Second, it aimed to chart the historical evolution of how those names evolved. Check. And then third, it aimed to see how old these names are. Check. Sort of. Well, they don't know the exact age. They know that most of these names are more than a few hundred years old. And I think it's important to acknowledge the backdrop that this study was written in. We've seen efforts to rename many natural features to their indigenous place names in recent years, like changing Mount McKinley in Alaska to Denali. And there have been calls by some Puyallup tribal members in the past to look at changing the name of Mount Rainier. It wasn't Zeke's motivation, and if anything, this paper shows that there are actually quite a few names for the mountain. It depends on the tribe, the language, the region. While one in particular may stand out more than the others, it would take a while to find agreement on what a common indigenous name and the form of that name would even be. But Zeke sees the benefits of this study as more than just a search for the quote-unquote original or correct name of Mount Rainier. In a certain sense, they're all original. They're all correct.
The name and the history that goes with the name enriches our education about history, about the people we live around. And I think that enriches everyone's life around the world, knowing that the indigenous name of Mount Rainier is Tacoma or Tacoma, or, a form of that, or Huac, or a form of that. And then knowing what those names mean and how they distribute geographically around the mountain by the different tribes. I think that's incredibly enriching. There's a value for all of us around the world to work on preserving these place names and these languages that unlock so much history and insight into how they see the world and so on. We grew up believing that was a sacred entity in our world, a sacred mountain. And the waters that flow from that sacred mountain come down and nurture all life, this land that we live on.
Every name tells a story.
Yeah, every name, that's a very nice thing to say. Every name tells a story. And as well as Mount Rainier. Rainier tells a story.
Yeah, language can unlock so much understanding about our history and culture. Alec, thank you so much for bringing us this paper, bringing us the conversation with Zeke, and the story behind it.
Yeah, thank you, Libby.
And thanks to Alec Cowan for filing that story before he moved on to a new, exciting podcast job with KUOW. Thanks for listening to Soundside. And hey, this show is only possible because listeners support us. If you are able to give right now, check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m., Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org.